Our speaker today is Robert Kaufman. He is Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Rutgers University. He received his Ph.D. from Harvard University, and he has published Dictators and Democrats, Elites, Masses, and Regime Change, Development, Democracy, and Welfare in Latin America, East Asia, and Eastern Europe, The Political Economy of Democratic Transitions, which won the 1995 Luebbert Prize for the best book in comparative politics by the Comparative Politics Section of the American Political Science Association. He is also the winner of this year's Guillermo O'Donnell Prize from the Latin American Studies Association. And we are very lucky to have him here today. I have the great fortune of chairing this panel. I chaired a panel 10 years ago when Professor Kaufman was speaking here, soon after he had published Development, Democracy, and Welfare State. So it's great to have him back here. My name, by the way, is Desmond Arias. I'm the Marx Chair in Western Hemisphere Affairs at Baruch College here in the City University of New York. The title of Professor Kaufman's presentation today is Democracy in Latin America, Historical Perspectives and Contemporary Challenges, a almost unique, timely topic given the results of the Brazilian election this weekend. So without further ado, Professor Kaufman.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about democracy from a perspective of around 30,000 feet. So I think that it's clear that from that height you can't capture the nuances and specificities of individual countries. Maybe we'll talk about Brazil, I hope so. But I want to kind of present a more general picture. And I hope that what I can do is offer some comments that will serve as the basis for a good conversation. So that's my objective. Now, let me begin. Desmond was kind enough to not to mention the year that I got my PhD at Harvard. It was 1967. So I've been around a while. And I'd like to begin by making some observations about how things have changed in Latin America over the last 50 years since I was getting started. So when I was getting started as a young scholar in the late 1960s, the only durable democracies around were, or seemed to be at least, Costa Rica, Venezuela, and Colombia, if you consider that a democracy. And autocracies dominated the rest of the region. There were personalist dictatorships in Central America and the Caribbean, dominant party regimes in Mexico and Cuba, military regimes in the rest of the region, including the so-called bureaucratic authoritarian regimes that emerged in Argentina and Brazil during the 60s, and then a few years later in Chile and Uruguay. And what was, I think, especially surprising about the emergence of these military regimes in the more developed countries was not only that these were relatively modernized societies where you wouldn't have expected autocracy to emerge, but also these were ferociously repressive regimes that excluded and repressed popular sectors and their representatives in the unions and the political left. And I want to emphasize this because it's important not to let how much all the time that's passed really blur the memories of how bad these dictatorships were. I mean, I list the things that they do in my notes. I still can't believe it. These were governments that collaborated to chase down people and kill them across national boundaries. And so there was a kind of an assassination network. These were regimes that engaged in pervasive censorship. These were regimes that arrested tens of thousands of political prisoners and engaged in widespread torture. In the case of Argentina, which was probably the most modernized and literate country in Latin America, the military stole the children of pregnant women and threw people out of helicopters. and disappeared thousands of victims. So in the political science world of that time, a lot of our attention and community was directed to why such regimes emerged and what it would take to push them out of power, and what would take their place. And the political regimes, democratic or semi-democratic, that have replaced these dictatorships have faced very serious challenges, and I want to talk about those in just a moment. But I think the ferocity and repressiveness of these dictatorships of the 60s and 70s is an important baseline for understanding both the achievements and the problems that Latin America faces today. And if you look back to that period, it's possible, I think, to point to some important areas of progress over the last 50 years or so. Things, I dare say, you may disagree with me, but things are better in a lot of different ways. I mean, for one thing, people are less subject to systematic political repression. Yes, governments abuse power continually throughout the region, but generally not with the ferocity and scale and systematic character of 50 years ago. So despite the abuses of the present, people, I think it's fair to say, are freer than they were. And there's also been an expansion of civil rights. Again, lots of violations as well. Journalists are murdered or intimidated. Indigenous communities are often a struggle against powerful forces. Women in most of the region have yet to attain the rights that they're entitled to. So all of those things are present. But even so, if you look around the region, in most of the countries, you see a lot of debate, you see a vibrant civil society, and you see people exercising their rights to protest and demonstrate. And then finally, this is particularly pertinent because of Brazil, but I think that the threat of outright military coups has declined considerably in Latin America. Look, the military continues to be an important political force in most societies. It's very active at the local level. It engages in abuses, significant abuses in that capacity. But I also think that governments, much more today than before, really have to submit to legitimation through competitive elections, or at least semi-competitive elections. They can't really govern today like they did before through the military establishment alone. It's one of the reasons, I'm sure we'll talk about Brazil, that I don't think there will be a new military dictatorship in Brazil. So one of the indications, a very crude one, of the improvement of the progress that I just described is the improvement in Freedom House political rights and civil liberty scores. And this is one. So thank you. This compares political rights and civil liberty scores between 1978, which was kind of the year before the first of the third wave transitions in Latin America. And then the most recent data I could get was 2017. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Freedom House framework, the ratings go from 1, which is the most positive, to 7, which is the most negative. And what you can see, I think, and I'm not going to describe these charts in detail, but what you can see is that on the one hand, there are a lot of countries that are not fully, do not reach the optimal scores, that are at best only partly free. Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, El Salvador, Peru, and Paraguay, I think, all rank with 3s on the change in civil liberties. But in the political freedom, Venezuela, Colombia, and the United States have shown deterioration. But in most of the countries, there's been substantial improvement. And I think these are not to be reified. I mean, they are what they are, but I think they do reflect real changes and real improvements in the region. If you go forward to the present, if you fast forward, it's also very clear that contemporary democracies are struggling and are in serious danger in certain cases. They haven't worked very well in most of the countries, and in some places they've gone backward in terms of democracy, and then democracy is on the defensive everywhere in the rest of the world, including, of course, most importantly, the United States. So what I'd like to do is offer some hypotheses and generalizations about these contemporary challenges. And in talking about the challenges, first I want to be clear about what I mean by democracy. And in my conception, it doesn't have to be yours, I follow the practice of most political scientists by limiting the definition primarily to political procedures and institutions. So class relations, economic conditions are circumstances which certainly can affect the quality and effectiveness of democratic institutions, but I consider them analytically distinct from the concept of democracy itself. So the main criteria, roughly speaking, are free and fair elections in which the winners are allowed to govern, governments that actively enforce citizen rights to freely engage in civil society and politics, and finally, and very importantly, horizontal accountability, what Guillermo called horizontal accountability, essentially the checks and balances that are based on independent legislative and judicial institutions, and of course a free press. And now no country ever meets these criteria perfectly, and this is especially true in Latin America, which is so unequal economically, and where very large segments of the population are marginalized socially and politically. But I think the capacity of the Latin American democracies to address those issues of inequality and marginalization depend, in part at least, on how they confront a number of other political and institutional challenges. And I want to highlight three of these challenges in particular. One is the limited capacity of states to extend the rule of law throughout their territories. The second are the threats to horizontal accountability. And the third are the strong international headwinds that have been created by the deterioration of democracy in the United States and Western Europe. And all three of these, I think, are very serious problems for Latin America. First, let me tackle the issue of state capacity. Some of you may remember Juan Lentz and Al Stephan's book on democratic consolidation, which they argued that what they call a usable state is a crucial requisite of democratic consolidation. And by that, I think they meant a state bureaucracy that can actually deploy its financial resources and human resources to protect citizen rights and deliver basic services. And I think that although some states in Latin America are more usable than others, are more usable than others, in general, state capacity is rather limited. The most visible signs of this limitation are the corruption scandals at the top of the system. We've all read about those, where politicians in Mexico, Brazil, Peru, Honduras, Guatemala have exploited their office to either line their own pockets or to fund their campaigns, or both. But I want to emphasize, these are very serious, but what I would like to emphasize is another aspect of state weakness that's evident at the local level, where citizens have the most direct contact with Latin American states. And here I draw and acknowledge the work of Desmond in this. one way of thinking about this at the local level is to use the metaphor of brown areas. It's a phrase that Jerome O'Donnell coined, I think, originally. And it signifies areas where the state lacks the presence to, or will, to enforce the writ of law. Where the state, there may be officials, but they're not representing of a kind of lawful state. And I think in recent decades, brown areas have spread considerably as a result of arms trafficking and drug trafficking. And those of us who have been concerned with problems of consolidation need to pay a lot more attention to the fact that states often are unable to impede the encroachment of gangs at that level, or drug traffickers, or to provide basic security, or even to prevent the extortion of the population by public officials themselves. As Desmond has written, by the way, and I use his work, criminality in brown areas can impact the political process directly in a number of ways. Criminals themselves can occupy public office. They can influence ballot access, campaigning, civil society strategies, and so forth. But the effects of criminality go way beyond the direct impact on politics. What the spread of brown areas has meant more generally is that there's a pervasive sense of insecurity in which both the police and the gangs can be sources of threats to life and property, which is a startling and awful prospect to think about, that you can't trust the police. Now, research into the scope and dimensions of local level criminality is fraught, dangerous, and I think it's only beginning to appear on the radar of people like me, people who study democratic consolidation. I think you can get a sense of the local level problems of state weakness just by looking at the level of mass public opinion. And I just want to kind of quote to you a few findings from recent surveys and the Latin American public opinion polls that illustrate this very well. Listen to this. This is stunning. Almost a quarter of the respondents in the report of 2017 report that they've been victims of crime. And this doesn't include the indirect effects. They have families who are indirectly affected by crime. About 40% feel either somewhat or very unsafe in their neighborhoods. And that's the highest of any previous round of surveys. About 20% report having to pay a bribe to either government or police officials. And you can be sure that's probably higher because there's a social bias against admitting that you paid a bribe. So, that is, that form of bribery and extortion is common. Countries where bribery was most extensive were Bolivia, Haiti, Paraguay, Mexico, Peru, and Venezuela. Over 60% of the population had no confidence or little confidence that the judiciary would punish the guilty. And that's the highest percentage registered in the series of surveys since 2006. And about 60% of the sample believe that half or all politicians were corrupt. And you might not be surprised that Brazil, Mexico, and Peru are at the top of that list. So it shouldn't be surprising, given those kinds of responses, that there's a lot of skepticism in Latin America, public skepticism about the value of democracy. There's a standard kind of survey question that's often asked, whether people disagree or agree with the statement that democracy may have problems, but it's better than any other form government. And in Latin America, there's been a decline, about 10% overall in the last 13 or 14 years. And the breakdown by country, which I have on the side of this slide, is also interesting. Shows that there are some countries, Uruguay and Costa Rica in particular, rank fairly high in terms of support for democracy, which is not a surprise. But the percentages in most of the rest of Latin America fall off very rapidly. And again, I'm struck that two of the largest countries, Brazil and Mexico, are near the bottom, around 50% or less disagree with the statement that democracy is the best form. So, in other words, to quote Lenz and Stephan, about half of the population of these societies do not think that democracy is the only game in town. And that is obviously, to me at least, a disturbing percentage. Now let me turn to a second challenge to democracy. And this comes from officials who come to power through democratic channels, but then who act in ways that undermine constitutional government from within. And in the last couple of decades, the threat has, I think, been most direct from the election of autocratic presidents who then incrementally dismantled civil liberties and constitutional checks in the name of popular majorities. And I'm thinking very specifically of Chavez, who's the iconic figure in this regard, but he's not the only one. There's a number of other examples of that. And now these particular set of populist leaders identify with the political left. And I want to acknowledge that they give voice to, the reason they're there is they give voice to marginalized sectors. And that support in turn reflects very real problems of high inequality, slow growth, profound frustration with the fecklessness of democratic governments. And there's real grievances that they capture. But just because they're popular doesn't mean they're democratic. If they use their power, and these do, to foreclose opportunities for voters to change their mind. Once you get in, then you start manipulating the electoral system in ways that make opposition very difficult. Now, I mentioned that there's, the initial or sort of the most recent kind of threat has come from the left, but I also want to emphasize that they can come from the right, these threats as well. There are right-wing populists as well as left-wing populists. And if you think outside of Latin America, there's Orban in Hungary, Erdogan in Turkey, and of course Trump here in the United States. And now in Brazil, in Latin America again, we have the specter of right-wing populism with Jair Bolsonaro as a particular threat. Now, what I want to emphasize about left and right-wing populists is that they really have more things alike than they are different. It's more style than ideology. And they really are in many ways, Trump and Chavez are really, for example, are really cut out of the same cloth. High degree of personal, direct attempt to mobilize loyal followers. Characterization of adversaries, of competitors as enemies or traitors. Contempt for independent institutions of horizontal accountability. These are characteristics of both the right and left populists. Now, there's still another dimension to this threat, and that is that in addition to autocratic presidents, legislators and judges can also abuse their authority in ways that undermine constitutional government. An obvious example of that is the politicized use of impeachment powers to depose legitimately elected presidents, such as, I would argue, in Brazil. And also in Brazil, this is a little trickier, and some of you, maybe many of you will disagree, but I think that even judicial attacks on corruption, and I think many of them are legally justified, have contributed to a rather dangerous polarization. And the paradox, let's leave aside the motivation of the prosecutors. I happen to think they're genuine. But whatever they are, whatever their motives, the rule of law is weakened if the actions of the judiciary are not credible to a large segment of the population. And this is a problem not only in Brazil, but most recently in Brazil. So if you think more broadly, the threats that are posed most visibly by populist presidents are really components of larger conflicts between the constituent parts of a liberal democracy. There's tension between a popularly elected president and an independent court and an independent Congress. And even in the most stable and well-formed liberal democracies, there's tension between these different parts. And managing those tensions requires politicians who place a very high value on checks and balances themselves and who are willing to compromise. In Latin America, as I've already noted, there's a deterioration in public trust in institutions. And that in turn weakens the incentives of office holders to respect institutional norms. Why should they? Nobody cares about the institutions. And it strengthens their incentive to exploit the advantages of their office at the expense of the system as a whole. And the result is what some of my colleagues in political science have called careening between the conflicting institutional principles of liberal democracy, either constitutional stalemates or unfettered majoritarianism of populist presidents. It's not always clear, unlike coups d'etats, it's not always clear when this crosses the line into what Andreas Schedler has called electoral autocracies. But what is clear is that democracies are in serious danger when politicians and other political actors prefer confrontation and stalemate to incremental compromise. Unfortunately, I think that's rather common in the region. And let me turn finally to a third major challenge to democracy in Latin America, which comes from outside the region, and that's the polarization and deterioration of democratic norms in the United States. This is a situation which has been developing for decades, not exactly new, but they've become particularly acute since Donald Trump's election. And I think this has had a profound effect on the willingness and capacity of the United States to encourage the spread of democracy elsewhere in the world. Now, the implications for Latin America are actually somewhat complex because we can't forget that American influence in Latin America has often been characterized by malevolence or indifference to democracy and democratic aspirations. And I think this was especially true, not only, but especially during the Cold War when the American US governments backed right-wing dictatorships who sought to overthrow democratic governments that they saw as leaning too heavily towards Soviet influence. And the United States has also, I think, had a negative effect economically at times, not always. But I'm thinking particularly of the 1980s when they insisted on very rigid neoliberal reforms that did a lot to destabilize democracies that emerged in the 80s and 90s. But US policies also had periodically positive influences. And democratic aspirations in Latin America have benefited when these influences are in the ascendant. And I think this was true particularly since the collapse of the Soviet Union, because it encouraged U.S. governments to place a higher priority on supporting democratic reform as part of its own long-term interests. Now, it hasn't always acted consistently in those interests, but since the 1990s, through the 1990s and early 2000s, I think that the American government generally responded to democratization with either active support or benign neglect. And the weakening of democracy during the Trump era has, I think, brought that to an end and has really worked very seriously against the building and consolidation of democracy in Latin America. Now, in the United States, I think I've written a paper on this, by the way. We're going to come out with perspectives on politics. I don't think democracy in the United States, in the minimalist sense of free elections, is going to break down. But I think that there already has been, an erosion of democratic norms. It includes autocratic appeals, it includes the weaponization of law enforcement, and it includes efforts to undermine the independence of the courts and the press. And for the people in Latin America who hope to promote democracy, it means they really can't count on the United States as a supportive ally, at least not for the time being. Now, at the broadest level, one of the problems that Latin America faces with respect to Latin America is that the United States has become a destabilizing influence internationally. It's kind of pulled out, it's retreated from its role as a force for international stability, and I think that has serious implications for the United States. The State Department has been badly depleted from people who know anything about Latin America. And that means that, again, people who are trying to promote Latin America can't count on judicious, nuanced policies that both respect Latin American sovereignty and at the same time engage where it's useful in efforts at democracy promotion. And finally, less tangibly, but I think even perhaps more important, Trump has badly damaged the international image of the United States as a model, and a model of open, prosperous democratic society. And of course, we've never lived up to that image completely, but despite our failures, I think that image has had important resonance in Latin America. Now, the Trump era will come to an end at some point, and the pendulum is likely to swing at least part of the way back to more favorable policies. But again, in the meantime, the United States is contributing to a distinctly unfavorable international environment, and I think at least in my judgment, at least some of Trump's effects are likely to endure. So, is there a way forward from this? It's a rather bleak picture. Well, one thing to bear in mind is that the challenges to democracy in Latin America are not equally severe everywhere. There are some democracies that are doing relatively well. I see Marty Weinstein nodding. I think Uruguay, with all many problems, is still a pretty robust democratic system. Chile, Costa Rica, perhaps, with all their problems, democracy seems well entrenched. And we also shouldn't underestimate the persistence and determination of democratic forces throughout the region. I mean, there's still, important people in Latin America working for democracy. And I think that there are many things I suppose we can do to help. But as scholars, intellectuals, I think that one of the things we can do is to lay out, or at least reaffirm, principles that might contribute to building high-quality democracies in the region. In the first place, I want to return to a point I made earlier, which is that as both a policy and a moral imperative, it's essential for democratic governments to focus on reducing economic and gender and racial inequality. And some of my own research, by the way, I have to acknowledge, I have shown, I think, that high economic inequality does not lead to a collapse of democratic institutions. But it's also the case that the concentration of wealth is a corrupting influence. It reduces the incentives of the wealthy to contribute to public goods through taxes. Extreme wealth also bleeds over into political influence. So when you have extreme concentrations of wealth, you also have an extreme skewing of political power. And even if formal democracy survives in these kinds of settings, the reality is a very reduced space for popular voices. The second point that I would make is that democracies are unlikely to reduce inequality in the absence of a strong left, of parties, civil society organizations that are committed to fighting for equality within a democratic framework. Now, they don't always have to be in power. You know, the left can be in opposition as well. But there's a lot of evidence from both Europe and Latin America that the balance of political power in democratic systems have a very substantial effect on economic inequality, both directly through labor markets and indirectly through government policies. So a strong left, I would argue, is an essential component of a strong democracy. My third point, and Desmond, I'm almost finished. I only have 4 points, and I'm now on point 3. My third point is that a democratic fight for the reduction of inequality must be conducted with a clear-eyed understanding of what liberal democracy can and can't accomplish. There's a lot of evidence that some authoritarian regimes can produce massive social transformations. But in liberal democracies, where rights of a variety of interests have institutional protections, progress is inherently incremental. It's built around coalitions that are inclusive and compromise with rival political groups. This is actually a lesson we learned decades ago from the rise of bureaucratic authoritarian regimes, where democratic actors pursued maximalist strategies, democratic framework that ended by undermining the framework itself. And then finally, if liberal democracy is to respond effectively to the challenges it faces, both in Latin America and the world, political activists and mass publics need to value it for its own sake, as well as for the social and economic outcomes it can produce. Stable political systems rest on legitimacy as well as on effectiveness. And although these things are related, they're also distinct. And as we, I believe, saw in the 1960s and 70s, when support for democracy is purely instrumental, when it depends solely on its social and economic performance, this can pave the way for brutal autocracies when times are hard. So an important principle that needs to be reaffirmed is, to cite the survey question that I mentioned above, democracy is more likely to survive and prosper when it's viewed unconditionally as better than the alternatives. So thank you very much, and look forward to your comments and questions.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Kaufman. And now I'd like to open the floor to questions. We'd like to take groups of 3 questions. And if you could state your name and affiliation when you're called on, that would be appreciated.
My name is Hal Davis. I'm a citizen. I'm interested in your distinction between your definition of democracy vis-a-vis populism. populism, at least generically, one would say, is the notion that the majority rules. Democracy presumably has one of its essential principles, the notion that majority rules. So how do you sort of thread that needle? How do you navigate the tension between what the majority does when they have power and protecting other institutions that you described being part of the democracy?
My name is Leandro, and I work here at the Luebbert Center for Western Hemisphere Studies, and I got a couple of questions. Especially given that the first round of the Brazilian elections occurred this weekend, so I have a couple of very specific questions to you. Would you say that that there is a link between the military dictatorship in Brazil from the 1960s to the 80s and the current moment that the country is going through? And my second question is, would you say that democracy has failed in Brazil in any way? And if so, what would be the implications of that? So that's my two questions.
And, yes?
My name is Alejandro Rios. I teach art history and Latin American studies at William Princeton University. And my question is, how do you see the advocacy of the current Secretary General of the OAS in the promotion of democracy and human rights throughout the Western Hemisphere?
Okay, great questions. Democracy and populism, how do you distinguish? A simple way to put it, and it's probably too simple, is that democracy involves institutionalized forms of behavior. There are rules, and the rules kind of are, the personalities may be involved but in competition, but they operate within a framework of rules. That go from civil liberties and rule of law through the courts, through elections, through an independent legislature. I think populism, as I understand it, and people have different ideas of what populism is a much more personalistic, it has several characteristics which I think are not democratic. One is the glorification of the leader. And if you look at Chavez, or you look at Trump, or look at a number of other people, that there's a kind of an aggrandizement of their personality, and a claim that they and they alone speak for the people. I remember I was in Brazil, I was in Venezuela in 2004 during the referendum. And there were billboards all over Caracas saying, and let's see, how did it go? Chavez is the voice of the people, and the people are the voice of God. Now, unfortunately, we have a leader who kind of says that too, but in the good old days, you might have been worried about that. The other thing I think that's important about populism that is different from normal democracy is that populist leaders not only elevate their personality, but also don't think of their competitors as legal, legitimate competitors, but as enemies of the people, enemies of the nation. And so when you hear somebody like Donald Trump leading chants saying "lock her up," this is a populist thing, but you wouldn't expect this in a democratic system. And then sort of what flows from that is this kind of majoritarian claim. You're right that there's a majoritarian claim that we represent the people, and there's also an electoral claim, we are elected. But there's also I think, a sense that once you're elected, you have a right to kind of undermine other institutions of liberal democracy. And that's what I think has happened in various Latin American countries, and what our challenge that we're facing here in this country. So, by the way, I was telling somebody coming up here. There is, if any of you are interested, there's a article that I've just done with my co-author, Stephan Haggard, in which we compare Donald Trump with Chavez, Orban, and Erdogan. And we talk about the rise of these three autocrats to power, and then we ask what the similarities and differences are in the United States. There are differences, but there are also some disturbing similarities. The next question, two questions, was the link between the old dictatorship. Oh, where did the question? Oh, there you are. The link between the old dictatorship of the 60s and 70s and the present. Well, there's some personal links, right? That Bolsonaro was a member of the military back then, and his running mate is a military guy who, and both of them look back nostalgically on the military as that dictatorship as, you know, something that could really take control of things, set things right. This requires a longer discussion, but I think it's difficult. I'm not great at predicting things, so you should discount anything I say, but I think it would be difficult for them to replicate what went on in the 60s and 70s. There's just too much that has changed in Brazil since that's happened. And my guess, although I don't have evidence for it, is that most of the military has no taste whatsoever for that kind of a dictatorship. And if I may, I can go on to say that I think Bolsonaro will win. Maybe he won't. I hope he doesn't, but I think he will. But I think it's going to be very hard for him to do what Chavez or some of these other populists have done, in part because he won't control the legislature. That the legislature is still very fragmented. And one of the keys to consolidating power in Venezuela and in Turkey and Hungary was that the populists controlled the populist majorities controlled the legislature. And that legitimated a lot of other things that they did. They could pack the courts, they could, weaponize law enforcement, they could do a lot of other things, but you need to control the legislature in order to be able to do that. One of the reasons, by the way, that I think the 2018 elections here are so important is because I think Trump is trying to do the same thing. And if his control of the legislature is reaffirmed, I think that'll give him much greater latitude to do some of the things that he clearly wants to do. Has democracy failed in Brazil? Well, not yet, I guess is the way I would put it. And of course it depends on what your standards of failure and success are. It hasn't done very well. It's been a big disappointment. Whether it can do better, one of the things that I think about Brazil is that it's a little bit schizophrenic, I guess is the right way to put it, or manic depressive. So either, everything is going to be great and Brazil will be the country of the future, or everything is terrible and there's no hope. And these things tend to go in waves. And right now people think everything is terrible and there's no hope. Things look pretty bleak, but we've been there before and seen improvement. So maybe we will again. One other thing though I would say is that in a certain sense that's a failure, because if you swing back and forth between optimism that's unrealistic and pessimism that's unrealistic, it means that there's no linear improvement, over time. Just kind of these depressing circularities. What about the OAS? I admire the Secretary General of the OAS. I think he's been a real his heart is in the right place, and he's been a real force for good. His biggest challenge has been to try to find a solution to Venezuela, and that I think he's failed, and I think he admits he's failed. I saw him at a meeting of the Council on Foreign Relations about 6 months or 8 months ago. And he didn't say this in so many words, but what I heard him do was basically throw up his hands and say, look, you know, the opposition can't survive inside Venezuela, and you can't negotiate with the Venezuelan government because they're thugs, and they have no intention of relinquishing power. And to me, that means, I mean, I'm not disputing that, but to me that means that the mission of trying to figure out some soft landing for Venezuela is not going well.
Okay, so that was the first round of questions. So let's take a second round of questions. If you could state your name and your affiliation when you raise your question, that'd be great.
My name is Eres Sushani. I'm from Israel. I'm a faculty member at the Rupin. I'm a faculty member at the Rupin Academic Center in Israel, where I teach international relations. I thought that your comments on the challenges to democracy were very interesting. I was wondering if you had some thoughts about challenges that are rooted in the international system, so to speak, or you have some comments on that have to do with systemic level of analysis about the challenges for democracy in Latin America.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Juliana. I was a student at Berkeley College, master's degree in political science. It's more like a comment. I don't know if you can develop, but how do you think like Wall Street can influence other political systems in Latin America? For instance, in Brazil, we saw decrease the valuation of the currency during the impeachment of Dilma. And right now, the exchange rate is very high when the independent goes to a left-wing party. So we see that Wall Street has a big influence in Latin America politics. So.
Hi, my name is Philip Johnson. I'm a Ph.D. candidate here at the Graduate Center. When you mention O'Donnell's idea of brown areas, right? He in the work where he develops that, he says we shouldn't think only of regimes as being authoritarian, but the state itself can be authoritarianly structured. So to what extent do you think some of what we're seeing here is not just a failure of a certain type of democracy, procedural democracy, something like that, or liberal democracy, but a failure of a certain kind of state structure, perhaps a decentralized state or some other kind of state?
These are great questions, thank you, and comments. Systemic challenges. Well, I touched on that a little bit in my talk. I mean, I think that there's a kind of a general sense in which the American government has moved toward a very transactional approach. What can you do for me, and what can you do for me? What have you done for me lately? And this is really a major threat to the kind of the legal and international structure that's been built up since World War II, really. And more specifically, that includes pulling out of trade deals, includes very serious decision to pull out of the TPP, for example, and that a disastrous decision, because the Trans-Pacific Partnership knit together a whole range of both Asian and Latin American countries in a kind of an integrated economic system, and that's been blown up. That provided real opportunities, and it's just been destroyed. And there are other examples I can give. One of the implications of the withdrawal from the TPP is enlarging the role of China in Latin America. that this has opened doors. Well, China was already becoming a powerful interest, but this has kind of removed any friction along those lines. One of the ironies is that the renegotiation of NAFTA, which by the way hasn't been ratified, but the renegotiation of NAFTA really, is kind of the TPP light. It incorporates a lot of the provisions of the TPP, but of course among a smaller range of countries and not to the extent that was embedded in the TPP. So, I mean, the general point, I think, and it's a really good question, is that the international system is being destabilized, and that's going to affect countries everywhere, and including Latin America, which is going to be very hard to kind of figure out how to navigate a much more turbulent international system. And this doesn't take into account environmental issues, there's just a variety of ways that the international system is unfriendly toward democracy in Latin America. The role of Wall Street. Look, I mean, Wall Street is, a little bit of a vague concept, but I mean, it's very clear that financial capital in the United States particularly, but also in Western Europe, has a tremendous impact on what goes on in Latin America. I mean, there's just a huge volume of research that discusses that. One very good book that was done by a Brazilian friend of mine, Daniela Campello, I don't know whether you read it, talks about how financial flows affect party platforms. And when money is flowing out, that places a constraint on contending politicians, placed a constraint, for example, on the PT through much of the 2000s. And she at least argues that part of the moderation of the PT came from the threats of capital flight that was involved in financial capital. Of course, the converse is also true, that when capital is flowing, in her telling, when capital is flowing in, you can be more reckless. Chavez, for example, became incredibly reckless after this huge rise of petroleum prices in the mid-2000s. Before that, he was actually fairly cautious in terms of his economic policy. And one could make an interpretation of the late Lula and Dilma period as taking too much advantage of good capital flows. And now, by Wall Street, you also may mean the Federal Reserve or the central bank. And it's clear also that the central bank of the United States has a tremendous impact on Latin American exchange rates and the Latin American economy. So when the United States raises its interest rates, which it has done now in the last year or so, it puts a lot of pressure on the exchange rate in Latin America, and that's what's among the things that's happened in Brazil. It's also happened in Argentina and so forth. I mean, money flows out when interest rates are rising in the West into safer Western havens. I don't subscribe to a conspiratorial picture of this. I think these are economic actors responding to market incentives. And I don't see this as financial coups. Maybe I'm wrong, but it has the effect of, it does impose tremendous constraints. And it will impose a big constraint on Bolsonaro. The question about brown area is a good question too. Actually, Guillermo, I think, meant, you're right, that Guillermo meant two things. And I only decided one of them. And one thing is, that you have what in effect is an area where the state doesn't have much presence. You may have police officers, but they're acting on their own, and judges and mayors, but they're not really, they're acting unconstrained by the constitution or the law and the system. And then you have also situations, which is quite different actually, in which you have local autocracies, which may be in league with the central government. You know, there may be pacts between the central and the local autocrat. I think those situations are pervasive, but I think they're more vulnerable to reform, and they're more, you know, it's more possible to think about reform of those, depending on, because they're very dependent on political alliances at the national level. And so if politics changes at the national level, that can affect the configuration of power at the local level. It's much harder to build state capacity where it doesn't exist, in brown areas where it's, you know, where the police are busy extorting the population or the judges or mayors. And, you know, maybe Desmond can talk to this, but I really don't know what the solution to those things are.
My name is Ticia Gonzalez. I belong to an organization that is affiliated to the United Nations, to the civil society, ECOSOC, which is the International Union for Land Value Taxation. And beside that, indigenous, African descendants, women, and Honduran. And you didn't mention Honduras, but I see a lot of similarity with what goes on in the United States right now and what is happening in Honduras, which is what I personally call lateralization of democracy, which is the three powers are consolidated in one direction. Where is the hope now with that tendency, and how United States is continuing to lead and have been an example? I know my country, so Honduras has been a very devoted friend of the United States. What we can hope now with this tendency?
Hi, my name is Grace, and I am a student at the City College of New York. My question, not so much of a question, but I was hoping you can comment on maybe any thoughts that you had on the indigenous movement in Latin America and the effects that it's had on democracy, especially since you made the comment that in order for higher quality democracy, we need a stronger left, and especially since indigenous movements have been associated with the left, and what you think their impact is in Latin America. Thank you.
My name is Sandy Stein. I was a student of Latin American Studies. Does the OAS have any positive powers to take a more aggressive position on Venezuela?
Hello, Stanley. I remember your work. I know your work from some years ago.
I'm sorry?
I said I remember I know your work from some years ago. So, well, these are questions I'm not sure I can answer very well. First of all, I apologize. Honduras is not a country that I know very well. I know, kind of the broad picture, but not the kind of fine detail that I would need. I think that that the characteristic, what I see as a general threat to democracy in Latin America probably does apply to Honduras, and that is that politicians are incentivized to exploit their office on all sides, So, and that means to some extent exploited to be corrupt, but it also means exploited to grab power, and that is a feature that leads to the deinstitutionalization, not that Honduras was ever very institutionalized, but the deinstitutionalization of the system. And so what I do know about Honduras is that the president and the courts and the Congress have, behaved in quite autocratic, undemocratic ways, and the military. But I'm not sure I can take this much beyond. But
I guess the question was because I think there are some kind of lines, guidance that we can look for this check and balance and to recover the democracy, because the way I see it, there is no democracy. You have to redefine what.
Well, there's another problem with Honduras that also is showing up in the bigger countries in South America, which is the lack of law and order. The role of gangs, and the state can't. It's not only that it's acting undemocratically; it can't impose order. How do you get out of this? I'm really not sure. I think that in a small country like Honduras, you need international allies. And unfortunately, right now, there aren't any, or at least there aren't powerful international allies. The other thing I would say, which I think is important throughout Latin America and in Honduras as well, is civil society. And I think that the part of the answer has to be building civil society organizations, that can establish a presence at the local level, constitute some kind of pressure on the state, and forge alliances internationally, transnationally, with other NGOs and other civil society groups and other societies. That's not a magic bullet, okay, but it's where I think one should try to go. Question about indigenous movements, who asked that? So, and what was the question again? I just wrote down indigenous movements and now I can't remember.
Yes, of course. So it's specific into when you talked about higher quality of democracy, you talked about a stronger left movement and the need for balance. I was just wondering what your thoughts are on how the indigenous have impacted that or their influence within Latin America.
Well, I think that, indigenous movements are flowering in Latin America. It doesn't mean they're winning, but at least they're emerging and they're making their voices heard. And with some impact in some societies. I think that, it's in Ecuador and Bolivia and some of the Andean countries particularly. In Chile also, actually, Mapuche have become an important political force. Sometimes it gets kind of nasty, but that's how social movements, that's part of the repertoire of social movements. I do think, there's a book by Raul Madrid on indigenous populism in Bolivia. But actually he looks at not only Bolivia, but also Peru and Ecuador. And makes a couple of points that I think are interesting. One is that the most successful indigenous movement is the MAS in Bolivia. And one of the reasons it's successful, he argues, is because it really doesn't draw a sharp line between indigenous and non-indigenous. It reaches out, and some of its principal leaders are mestizo. And of course, the ethnic divisions within the indigenous community of Ira, Quechua, and so forth are not emphasized. So smoothing out the kind of cleavages that ethnicity sometimes brings was an important part of the route to power. Now, what have been the effects of that in Bolivia? Again, this is quite controversial. But there's good and bad news. The good news is that, there's significant improvement in the lives of the indigenous, that they have voice, they have, space in the system and political power. The bad news is that this has come, at least to some extent, at the expense of liberal democracy, I guess you would say, that, that there's been a concentration of power by Morales and over the MAS and of the MAS that is worrying. And, let me just say this, let me be clear about this. I think it's worrying because majorities change. And what may have majority support today may not have majority support tomorrow. And if you don't have a system where those changes are registered in the government and the electorate, you have a kind of rigidity that can lead to very negative results. I think that's what happened in Venezuela. I think Venezuela, Chavez's a very popular guy, he made a lot of good reforms, I suppose, for the population, but he rigged the system in a way that he couldn't lose. And of course, what's happened is that he and his successor both have clung to power in ways which now have descended into repression, horrible repression, driving millions of people out of the country. So, good and bad, The OAS kind of take a more aggressive, well, I had already talked about the effort to deal with the Venezuela situation, and that has, essentially collapsed. Maybe it'll revive, but it's for now at least dead. And the problem the OAS faces, and really in a certain sense all international organizations, but it's been particularly true of the OAS, is that it's very dependent on, it first of all has very strong inhibitions, deservedly so, against violating national sovereignty. So that automatically means that there's a real constraint on how the OAS can intervene in situations where governments are behaving badly. And the other thing is that the OAS is very dependent on political coalitions that are divided. And so for many years, the OAS couldn't do anything about Venezuela because Venezuela had the support of Lula in Brazil, and had support of Cristina Fernandez Kirchner in Argentina. It had the support of Ortega in Nicaragua. It had the support of Morales in Brazil. It had the support of Rafael Correa. So there was a coalition within the OAS that made it very hard for the OAS to act. And so I believe, and again, I don't follow the OAS as closely as I should, but in general, the OAS has made the right noises. It's espoused democracy and tried to encourage it, but it's really really has its power significantly constrained by the members, who the members are.
If you could state your name and affiliation.
Martin Weinstein, Emeritus from Princeton University. Bob, I'd like you to focus a little bit on renewal of the leads in the political parties and political leadership, and economic performance in terms of whether you have governability or confidence. And I just want to make a point about your emphasis early on about criminality. It's not just the increase in gangs and drugs, it's also where the society was before the increase in crime and drugs. They're going crazy about insecurity in Uruguay, and it's hurting the leftist coalition in power quite badly. and they'll probably lose for the first time in 15 years next year. So I think it's, again, it's perception. It's very much perception.
So I had a couple, well, I had one question with two parts. So when I listened to your talk, I think about the contrasts in debates about regime change in the 1960s and 1970s. So when we talked about, this came up early in your talk, when we talked about regime changes in the 1960s, we talked very much about military coups or other types of sudden decisive changes in regime. But by the 1970s, right, when O'Donnell and Schmidt are writing Transitions from Authoritarian Rule, they're talking about transitions. They're talking about a process. So the first part of the question I have is, what leads to this shift from an abrupt change in regime to a transition? And if we're talking today about transitions from democratic rule, could you, especially since you've been looking at different cases, describe somewhat what that process looks like and what actors are at play in that process? And the second piece of the question is, one thing that at times O'Donnell and Schmitter were coy about was, when they were writing about transitions from authoritarian rule, was transitions to what? Everybody sort of took it to mean we were talking about a return to democracy, but they were careful. They hedged their bets in that early phase of that debate and left that open. It was transitions from authoritarian rule. And I think one of the things we're seeing in the region today is potentially transitions from democratic rule. Certainly Venezuela gives us an example of a quite stark transition to authoritarianism, although it took a long time to get there and there were lots of layers to that change. But I wonder if there are other things that we might be transitioning to that are not per se authoritarianism, but that are different from democracy.
In that context, the case like Cuba, if we were to apply, and I am not suggesting that Cuba is going to transition to anything soon or rapidly. If we were to apply your new thinking and transition, your thinking to Cuba, what would that tell us to what is likely to happen in the near future in light of Desmond's comment about different kinds of transformations? The second comment I'd like to make is, we are going to be posting your paper, right, on the website? Your paper, your talk today was based on a paper.
Well, yeah, you can do that. I mean, as long as Lassen doesn't disagree.
The talk will be posted on the website, the webpage, so you'll be able to download it and read it. The second commercial is that we have a talk on democracy in Brazil at the beginning of November. Our friend David Fleischer will be visiting us one more time to share an update on the results of the elections. The second, or the runoff elections, will take place on the 28th of October. So this will be in November, we forgot, we'll look it up. But it will be happening, so you may want to look forward to that. I mean, I hate to piggyback. I have one more question, which is around Desmond's point, which is how your thinking has evolved. Well, let's stop that and let's deal with this.
Okay, well, thank you. Those are, again, three great questions. I don't know about the renewal of elites. I mean, I think it varies by country, and some of the countries you have the same old faces. In some ways Brazil would be an example of that, except now we have Bolsonaro, but in other places I think there's renewal. I think that one thing that would be interesting to research is renewal within the military. I don't know the answer to that, but it seems to me there's generational change, and one of the questions that would be interesting to explore, I'm not familiar with any research, is whether that's led to changes in attitudes, changes in military conception of the role. of the military. In terms of performance, I presume you mean economic performance, right? I think there's a lot of evidence that when times are bad, there's, democracies are in danger. When times are bad, incumbent regimes are in danger. And Stephan Haggard and I made that kind of argument, 20 years ago. And I think there's been a lot of confirmation of that. That being said, there's a lot of cases where bad performance doesn't seem to lead to that. I mean, again, take Venezuela as a case. It's a disaster. So I would say that as long as the regime can pay the military, as long as they can pay the police, they can probably hang on. And as long as they're worried about what the consequences will be if they withdraw, they have a lot of incentives and resources to hang on, even in catastrophic situations. Your point about the perception of criminality, I think, is a very important one. I think criminality is real in Latin America. I think that it is a growing problem. Murder rates are through the roof in places like Mexico and Brazil. And that's not just sort of people magnifying the problem. I think it's real. My wife is Brazilian, my wife's family is Brazilian. There's not a single member of her family, not a single member, that at some point has not been assaulted, and sometimes quite violently. I mean, sometimes it's kind of give me your wallet, so they give me a wallet. Sometimes worse than that. So, and these are not, these are not rich people, they're not poor, they're very middle class. But these are real problems, I think. Now, it is the case that that you can politicize that in a way that, unscrupulous right wing, could be left wing. Politicians take advantage of that. And that apparently is what the story is in Uruguay. I want to say something you're not going to like, which is that I don't know what the opposition is in Uruguay. But 15 years in power is a long time.
Oh, absolutely.
Maybe it's time for the left to regroup a little bit outside the government. So, Desmond, you have a lot of questions here about that. I'm not sure I'll be able to unpack them all. Let me just focus on one aspect of it, which is the difference between sudden regime changes that we saw in the 60s and 70s and sort of incremental transitions. Now, I'm going to assume that both of those are toward non-democratic regimes. I don't know whether that was part of your question or not. And I think that the failure of democracy, the decline of democracy, is a very different animal than it was 50 years ago. And 50 years ago, the military in most of the region, I think made some kind of ideological claim to be defenders of national security and national identity. Claims, they weren't legitimate claims. But that gave them the basis to take over the government. This is what you saw in Brazil, this is what you saw in Chile, and so forth. They had help from the United States, but I don't think we should underestimate local motivations too. What's happened in the last 50 years is that, and particularly since the fall of the Soviet Union, is that it's very difficult to legitimate governments that seize power that aren't elected. It's not impossible, but it's just very, internationally it's very difficult to to justify that. So I think that the transitions that we're looking at, the transitions from democracy that we're looking at today, are transitions that are by stealth. I mean, and it starts with well, in recent years it started with an elected executive. You know, this is the story. Now, Stephan Haggard and I have looked at 3 regimes that experienced backsliding toward what was clearly authoritarian regime: Venezuela, Hungary, and Turkey. And you know, there's no set pattern to that, but I think there is a kind of a story to tell in each of those cases. Unfortunately, there's some similarity in the United States. First of all, there's a high level of political polarization, that the different sides see each other as enemies. And that can stem from economic failure, it can stem from racial and ethnic divisions, it can stem from just demagogic kind of promotion. But in all of those cases, you have bitterly divided societies. And that makes it possible for politicians with autocratic appeals to gain power through the democratic system. Now, the second phase is taking over the legislature. We think that that's really important. And gaining majority control of the legislature helps to legitimate an autocratic project. It justifies packing the courts. It justifies using the law enforcement agencies to punish your enemies. It justifies putting pressure on the press. And this doesn't happen all at once. It happens little by little. So that I don't want to say you wake up one day and you're in an autocracy, that's a little too dramatic, but you slide in that direction. And over time it becomes more, the spaces for opposition narrow, and it becomes harder and harder to challenge the government. That hasn't happened yet in the United States, although it may. It's clearly happened in Venezuela. It happened in Hungary and Turkey as well. So I think that kind of incremental chipping away at gaining control of the main constitutional institutions and then chipping away at the constitutional constraints is the model. One of the reasons I don't think this is going to happen in Brazil is because I don't think that Bolsonaro can gain control of the legislature in the same way that these other leaders have done. I mean, you know, people like Orban, you know, legislature's a rubber stamp. It'll do anything he wants. That was true, a little less true of Chavez, pretty much true. I think the international norms have changed, and that accounts for the change and the nature of regime change, in my opinion. What do we know about, how can we talk about Cuba?
Well, your approach was developed historically for transitions toward democracy in the late 70s, 80s, 90s. And now you're adapting your analysis, as many others are, to your time. Well, obviously it's not fitting very neatly in any of those forms. What do you have anything to say about Cuba?
Less than I would like to say. Let me just throw out an idea that doesn't come from me, it comes from some work that other people have done. Joe Long and Dan Slater have written some very interesting things about democratization from above. And their story, they look at Taiwan, and they look at East Asian cases. And they argue, and these are all sort of one part, they look at, Taiwan as a major case. And these are all dominant party systems. That's why I think of Cuba. And their argument is that there comes a certain point at which the leaders of the dominant party realize that time is working against them. And that if they take the leadership in a transition, they can survive and operate within a more competitive system. Mexico might be another example of that with the PRI. If we move now, we can win elections. If we wait, we're going to be, time is against us, we're going to be discredited. I have not the faintest idea whether that makes any sense in the Cuban case. But it does seem to me that you have a change of leadership. You have young people in the party worried about where the system is going. And at least as a hypothesis, it might not be crazy to think that at some point they're going to decide, well, we're better off liberalizing the system. We can survive in a liberalized system. I have no idea whether that.
Well, let me take this last opportunity to thank Professor Kaufman for his presentation, to thank everybody for attending. We hope to see you again here at a event sponsored by the Builder Center. Thank you.